Over the past few weeks, Kit Guru has reviewed all 4 of the Granite Ridge desktop processors from AMD with Zen 5 technology. Ryzen 5 6-core, Ryzen 7 8-core, Ryzen 9 12-core, Ryzen 9 16-core. After those 4 reviews, AMD came out with some update information to do with a preview of Windows 11 24H2, which apparently fixed all manner of things. We did some work on that and we did a video along with some news, and then as a sideshow I decided to look at all these different Ryzen 7 models to see how Zen, Zen Plus, Zen 2, Zen 3, Zen 4 and Zen 5 behaved. In those later videos I made a point about my testing methodology with these Ryzen 7s, which was that I had disabled VBS, virtualization based security. Microsoft calls it core isolation. And the thing is, it became clear that AMD has been testing with core isolation enabled. There's quite a significant performance hit to enabling core isolation. In other words, we're testing 2 slightly different things. It seemed to me worth going over these processors once again to see the impact of core isolation, particularly as Microsoft has recently released a patch for Windows 11 23H2, which apparently gives the benefits of the pre-release 24H2. And then another thing cropped up. A whole bunch of our audience have been saying, why aren't you testing with Windows 10? And the explanation there is really simple. I stopped using Windows 10 when Intel launched their Alder Lake processors, that would be 12th gen, because the P-Core E-Core setup they told us required Windows 11 to work to full effect. So Windows 10 parked, Windows 11. I use Windows 11 on my own PC, I've been perfectly happy, but it seems a large part of our audience still uses Windows 10. So let us park these processors here and let's focus on these 6 Ryzen 7 processors. We've got Zen 2, Zen 3, Zen 3 3D, Zen 4, Zen 4 3D and Zen 5. And then I'm going to run a whole series of benchmarks. We've got the Windows that I used when I reviewed Zen 5. We've got the latest update with the Windows patch to mimic 24H2, and I'm doing that with both VBS Off and VBS On, and also we're using Windows 10. Let's get straight into the charts without any more chit chat. Here we have the original chart I showed you in the previous video for Geekbench 6 multi-core. You can see we have a huge variety of Ryzen 7 models, all the way from Zen 5 Ryzen 7 9700X at the top, right down to Ryzen 7 1800X at the bottom. Let's ditch those bottom 3 models and focus in on the more interesting, more relevant CPUs. I'm using the same color coding as before, so Zen 5 is blue, Zen 4 is yellow, Zen 3 is red, Zen 2 is green. You'll also note after each of the model codes I have the clock speed the processor was running at during the benchmark and the power it was drawing. That's the last time you'll see those clock speeds and power figures, because we're going to instead focus on the version of Windows and the exact settings within Windows. So here's the chart with all the different tests I've run in Geekbench 6, and there are plenty of them. This is an establishing test because really what we're interested in is going to be gaming, but Geekbench 6 is highly repeatable. The other thing it's worth noting is after the Ryzen 7 9700X at the top, the next processor down is now the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D rather than the Ryzen 7 7700. I put the 3D models above the non-3D models because, as I say, gaming is going to be the focus later in this video. Also worth noting, right at the bottom of the chart, I have not tested the Ryzen 7 3800X in Windows 10 because after a whole bunch of benchmarking it became quite apparent that Windows 10 for CPU tests for that processor was just an extra load of work that didn't really bring any illumination. Okay, this chart is quite clearly horribly complicated, so let's make it easier to understand. We're now looking at Geekbench 6 multi-core, and it's the version of Windows I used when I was reviewing Zen 5. You will note there are actually 2 versions of Windows because one of the platforms got updated during the rather long process of benchmarking all these CPUs. And now we have Geekbench 6 multi-core running on Windows 11 version 4112. This is with the new patch from Microsoft, and you'll notice VBS is off, just as it was when I was benchmarking originally. Let's switch back and forth between those two versions of Windows, and you can see there is some change, but it's very slight. And now let's go forward and turn VBS on, and you can see again there is some change, but it's quite slight. And it's a similar story when we move on to Windows 10 with these processors. As I say, the Zen 2 drops out of the chart. You can barely tell the difference. If I didn't tell you it was Windows 10 rather than Windows 11, you'd probably be none the wiser. And to make it crystal clear, let's look at each processor in turn, starting with the Zen 5 9700X. At the top we have unpatched Windows VBS Off, then we have patched Windows VBS Off, patched Windows VBS On, Windows 10. Nothing to choose between them. Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, original Windows, patched Windows VBS Off, patched Windows VBS On, Windows 10. Nothing to choose between them. Ryzen 7 7700, it's the same deal, although here we do see something of a hit with patched Windows with VBS enabled. Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, these four results are so similar it is just remarkable. Ryzen 7 5800X, again absolutely identical results. And finally Ryzen 7 3800XT. There is something to report here. First we have Windows 11 3880 with VBS off, then we see a significant jump with the patched Windows to version 4112 with VBS off, and then when you enable VBS it makes no difference. That looks very strange, but I'm standing by these figures. And now we've seen how this works, let's get through Cinebench R23 multi-core somewhat faster. With the Zen 5 Ryzen 7 9700X, we can see the scores are very equal. With the Zen 4 7800X 3D, it's a slightly different story. There's a tiny performance hit when VBS is enabled, and curiously Windows 10 performs quite poorly. With the Zen 4 7700, we can see that patching Windows and leaving VBS off makes no difference, but when VBS is enabled, there's a performance hit. Windows 10 performs about the same as Windows 11. With the Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, patching Windows gives a little bit of extra performance, turning on VBS gives a small performance hit, and Windows 10 looks good. With the regular Ryzen 7 5800X, patching Windows certainly helps performance. Enabling VBS gives a performance hit. Windows 10 looks good. It's curious to see how Zen 3 is so responsive to these changes in Windows. And when we look at the Zen 2 Ryzen 7 3800XT, when we patch Windows it makes absolutely no difference, and when we enable VBS there is a very small performance hit. And now we can move on to the fun stuff. It's time for games, and we're looking at Far Cry 6 set at 1080p, image quality on high. Remember, Far Cry 6 was one of the games that AMD was featuring when they were talking about the preview of Windows 11 24H2, starting with the Zen 5 9700X. With the original version of Windows VBS off, average of 173 FPS, 1% low 129. Run that Microsoft patch and the average pops up very slightly to 180. 1% low is unchanged. Enable VBS and the figures drop back. In essence, if you patch Windows, you can turn VBS on free of charge. The really strange thing here is Windows 10. We're running with VBS off. You should be aware that Windows 10 can run VBS. And here we see an enormous uplift, 198 FPS on average. Meanwhile, the 1% low remains at 124. Moving on to the Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. Original Windows, average of 194. Run the patch, 201. Turn on VBS, you drop back to 193. However, if you're running Windows 10 with VBS off, you get a mighty 229 FPS on average. Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7700. Original Windows 11, 146. Run the patch and you get a huge increase up to 159 FPS on average, and a hefty increase in the 1% lows to 115. Enable VBS and those figures drop back slightly. You're now slightly ahead of where you started. However, Windows 10, average of 171 FPS. It's a different story with the Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. On the original Windows we have an average of 185. Update with that Microsoft patch, we get a slight increase to 188 FPS and a slightly larger increase in the 1% lows from 118 to 124. Enable VBS and the figures drop right back. In fact, you're now worse off than when you started. If on the other hand you run Windows 10 with VBS off, the figures are pretty much exactly what we've already seen. And the Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X. We start at 135 FPS on average, we run the Windows patch and we pop up to 142 FPS and a healthy bump in the 1% lows. Then we enable VBS, the average drops back but the 1% low remains good. And if we switch over to Windows 10, the average is 139 FPS, the 1% low 89. So slightly improved on the original Windows 11. And what about the Zen 2 Ryzen 7 3800 XT? The original Windows 11, 114 FPS. Run the patch, we get an increase to 122 FPS and the 1% low goes up to 88. However, when we enable VBS, the figures drop back almost exactly to the same point as the original Windows 11. Our second game is Assassin's Creed Mirage, again at 1080p. This time the preset is ultra high. The Zen 5 Ryzen 7 9700X starts at 168 FPS with a 1% low of 110. Bizarrely, when we run the patch, the frame rate drops to 161 and a 1% low of 107. Turn on VBS, it drops further, 156 and 103. Switch over to Windows 10, 163 and 98. The original Windows 11 was the winner here. Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. On the original Windows, 184 FPS, run the patch 183, and a slight dip in 1% lows. Essentially the patch has no effect. Enable VBS, the frame rate drops 10 FPS. Switch over to Windows 10 and the frame rate is also low, 175 FPS. Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7700. We start at 150 FPS, 1% low of 98. We run the patch, it pops up to 156 with a 1% low of 104. We turn on VBS, we get a huge drop to 141 FPS, and if we go over to Windows 10, 157 FPS. On the other hand, the Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, we start at 162 FPS, we run the patch, we go up to 170, we turn on VBS, we dip to 163, and we switch to Windows 10 and we see 163 once again. The regular Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X starts at 127 FPS, with the patch 132, with VBS enabled 123, and on Windows 10 it's 128 FPS. The behaviour of Zen 3 seems very consistent, where Zen 4 is just bizarre. We finish with the Zen 2 Ryzen 7 3800 XT, starting at 106 FPS, with the patch 108 FPS, enable VBS, and we dip back to 106 FPS. Our third game is Cyberpunk 2077, again on 1080p, this time on Ultra preset. Worth noting, this is also a game featured by AMD in their news about the update for Windows 11 24H2. We start with the Zen 5 Ryzen 7 9700X, on original Windows 203 on average, with the patch 204. Enable VBS, it dips a huge amount to 187, and if you switch over to Windows 10, it's 182. The Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7800X 3D starts at 210, with the patch it's 211, turn on VBS 210. Well, that's peculiar. Once again, if you switch over to Windows 10 on this game, dips all the way down to 186. And the Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7700 starts at 187, but this time with the patch goes up to 198, which is utterly bizarre. Turn on VBS, drops down to 181, and if you go to Windows 10 it's 182. These results are very strange. The Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X starts at 194 FPS, with the patch goes up to 197, enable VBS it drops to 173, and Windows 10 182. There's no denying that VBS seems to have a huge impact in Cyberpunk 2077. The Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X, we start at 161, with the patch go up to 165, enable VBS we drop all the way back to 149, this time however on Windows 10 168. And we finish with the Zen 2 Ryzen 7 3800 XT. We start at 133 FPS. With the patch it goes to 134, i.e. no change. Enable VBS drops all the way to 119 FPS. And we finish with Total War Pharaoh, again at 1080p, this time on Ultra preset. Starting with the Zen 5 Ryzen 7 9700X, original Windows 11 224 FPS, and it patches up to 231. Enable VBS and it drops back to 223. Switch over to Windows 10 222. Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. We start at 240 FPS and with the patch we go up to 263. This time when we enable VBS we drop back to 251, so we're ahead of the original figure. Windows 10 does poorly at 237. Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7700. We start at 205 FPS. With the patch we go up to 209. Enable VBS we go back to 201. Windows 10 is also 205. Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. We start at 218 FPS. We run the Windows patch, we go up to 220. We enable VBS, we drop back slightly to 216. We don't have a Windows 10 figure for this processor. Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X. We start at 165 FPS. With the patch we go to 166. VBS drops us back to 163. However, Windows 10 is 170 FPS and the 1% lows 100 FPS. And finally, the Zen 2 Ryzen 7 3800 XT. We start at 141 FPS and with the Windows patch we see no change. Enabling VBS costs us 2 FPS and we dip to 139 FPS. And having battered you with all those charts, the question has to be, what is my conclusion? And the sad thing is I'm left with more questions than answers. The obvious point is that VBS has significant impact in certain games, but only certain games. Some games it appears to be a freebie, but we're not actually crystal clear what VBS does. It's some sort of Microsoft protection and security, but exactly what it does, I don't know. I've asked a few people, I'm still waiting for answers. I've never had a satisfactory answer to that question. You don't have to enable VBS, but it is on by default. Any pre-built PC is bound to have VBS enabled. So it seems to me the sensible thing going forward is for me to always test with VBS enabled and just forget about disabling VBS. As for Microsoft, what are they playing at the moment? Don't know. It's crystal clear Microsoft is hard at work on all sorts of AI, clearly, because everyone is, but also Windows on ARM. I had a word with some people from Intel and I understand that the work that's going into the branch prediction patch and also Windows 11 24H2 will apparently also be of benefit to Intel. Intel will need to do some work to take advantage of the change in Windows, and in their own words, that makes a nice change for them to benefit from what AMD has done. Should you update Windows when the option comes along? Realistically, you got no choice, so yes. What will the impact be? Well, in regular CPU workloads, Cinebench, Adobe Premiere, any form of rendering, I don't honestly think that the patch to do a branch prediction is going to make the blindest bit of difference. Similarly, enabling VBS in those kind of workloads doesn't seem to make any odds. It's all about games, and the games, it varies game to game. I presume engine to engine is really the thing. Also, it seems to me that the impact, depending on whether an AMD processor, we can't speak for Intel yet, whether it's a regular AMD processor or a 3D, i.e. extra cache on the processor, that varies again from game to game and from processor to processor. The Zen 3 Ryzen 7 5800X and 5800X 3Ds, they seem to be quite consistent. Patch Windows, you get an improvement. Turn on VBS, you take a hit. Windows 10 does okay. Whereas the Zen 4 processors are all over the place, and Zen 5 strikes me as being a tweaked version of Zen 4 and a new fabrication process. So Zen 4, Zen 5, you can take the same view on those processors. One thing I am going to take away, apart from if you currently have a Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, I wouldn't change it until the Zen 5 3D comes along and then see what you think of it. But it strikes me that the changes that Microsoft is up to, and I assume the games developers are also going to be doing in conjunction with those changes, they are going to have a significant impact on performance of these processors and indeed the AM5 platform, and presumably Intel Arrow Lake and Z890 when that comes along in the very near future. When I reviewed this Ryzen 7 9700X, my advice was, no, don't buy it, wait for the 3D version. And after all that testing, that remains my advice. Remember, KitGuru's on TikTok, and it's kitguru.net on the web.